Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. Well, everybody's talking about the Mueller report, which is one of the reasons why we're not going to spend all of our time talking about it. One, because you can certainly listen to the back and forth on what has been, again, something that has been awaited for some time. But I will give you a brief summary of it now, and then in the National Hour, we'll get into some of the conversation with it again. But as I've said on this program so many times before, we have not fixated on this for a variety of reasons. First of all, how much of it really affects your faith, your family, or your freedom? How much of it is even that relevant to the Trump presidency, although there were breathless comments made over the last almost 2 years that this will be the end of the presidency for Donald Trump. Matter of fact, apparently after reading this, we find out he said something similar to that as well. It, of course, turned out to be a lot of wind and sound and fury, if I can borrow a phrase, and result in very little. But let's, if we can, give you a little bit of a summary, and then we're going to get on to some other issues, because there are some that I think are pretty significant. And that is, of course, today, the Attorney General, William Barr, made public a redacted version of the more than 400-page report, less than 300 pages if you look at the content. But by the time you get to the appendices, which even you can see some of the response from the president, his own signature and everything, it's all right there. We have it on our website, so you can read it if you'd like. Of course, there are people making a big deal about what is redacted, and to be honest, there's, I think I saw somebody counted 800 redactions. Well, there's 400 pages. There are some ongoing investigations. It's you can read through the first few pages without running into any redaction. Then even as you get into some of the redactions, some of those are pretty light until you get to some sections where, yes, a whole page has been redacted for very good reasons, because these are ongoing investigations, which I hope will never be revealed, because some of those redactions might, if they're actually made public, might hurt one of these investigations, which might bring somebody to justice. But nevertheless, first of all, you had the Attorney General holding a press conference. That was the first surprise. Those of us that have followed President Donald Trump kind of expect it to just go on and on and on and on. No, it really didn't. Got up there, he explained briefly, and I'll give you a couple quotes from that in just a minute, on what he did, how he did it. Took, I think somebody counted maybe 5 questions from the audience. That was it. And it was over. And so then we've all been waiting for when this would be posted online. And at 11 o'clock Eastern, 10 o'clock Central, it was up there, and you can read it for yourself if you would like to do so. Again, this is a very thorough investigation, to put it mildly, although we will hear all sorts of people today in some of the talking head shows say they didn't investigate far enough. You know, those that are anti-Trump are going to say they should have conducted more interviews. I mean, they only conducted 500 interviews, and I'm being facetious, of course. Those who are convinced that the Clinton administration or the Clinton campaign or others have been involved in something nefarious, well, they will wish that there had been investigations in that regard. Of course, there have been 8 convictions, but none of them having to do with the issue of collusion. And Bill Barr, I should say, was very clear in saying that it cleared President Donald Trump of Russian collusion and of obstruction of justice, although I think you're going to be hearing a lot about that today, because there's a little bit of innuendo. I think some people counted 10 different places where it talks about various public statements made by the president, which some will accuse him of trying to do witness tampering because he's speaking out on those issues. And though I wish the president wouldn't speak out on a lot of issues with his Twitter account, he does. And he's not the first president to do so. Richard Nixon used to be speaking all the time about the Watergate investigation. Even an individual not being investigated, Barack Obama was very blunt about his views, for example, about a Supreme Court decision with the Supreme Court justices sitting right in front of him at a State of the Union address. So it's not the first time, nor will it be the last time we hear from a president speaking out about an investigation taking place or a judgment being made. And so we live with what we've got. But again, 22-month investigation. And Robert Mueller's investigation, according to the Attorney General William Barr, says there's no evidence of collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. If you read through it, you'll find out a little bit more about the Russian hacking and the groups that were involved in that, and the reality that none of them will ever have to stand trial in this country. Again, the Attorney General Bill Barr said after 2 years of investigation, the special counsel did confirm Russian meddling in the 2016 campaign, but no evidence of any collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. So obviously there was confirmation of Russia trying to do so. And when you see the meddling, in some cases, it's even a bit of an eye roller as well. There's there was an ad there was a Facebook post, and you're going, okay, maybe so. Not as bad as maybe you might think in your head. And we were led to believe sometimes that they were even going in there, possibly changing vote totals and all sorts of things. Not true. And that gets set aside pretty quickly. So it spends a fair amount of time talking about one group, which is the Internet Research Agency, which is the reason for Russian interference because it's backed by the Kremlin, by the Russians, work to disseminate political disinformation on the social media. And then there was another trying to maybe effectively hack into the Democratic National Committee emails. And maybe someday we'll actually figure out who was behind all of that, but that's maybe for another day as well. But again, back to the Attorney General Barr saying the special counsel found no evidence that any Americans, including anyone associated with the Trump campaigns, conspired or coordinated with the Russian government or the IRA, which is the Internet Research Agency, in carrying out this illegal scheme. He says, put another way, the special counsel found no collusion by any Americans in the IRA's illegal activity. Now, some on the conservative side have jumped on this saying, no, by any Americans. Wait a minute, what about Hillary Clinton? And what about the Steele dossier and all of that? Well, that investigation may take place in the future, but there's nothing, as far as I can tell, in the brief scan I did of the 400-plus pages that goes into that in any detail at all. One other point made by the Attorney General, WikiLeaks then made a series of document dumps. The special counsel also investigated whether any member or affiliate of the Trump campaign encouraged or otherwise played a role in the dissemination of those documents. Under applicable law, publication of these types of materials would not be criminal unless the publisher also participated in the underlying hacking conspiracy. Here, too, the special counsel's report did not find that any person associated with the Trump campaign illegally participated in the dissemination of materials. You would probably say on most cases, individuals would say, well, I guess that's it. Let's move on. But that's not what you're going to hear. You're going to hear people saying, well, maybe there was no collusion, but the reason there was no collusion because it was covered up by the conspiracy or the obstruction of justice by the president and his campaign. So that's probably the drumbeat you're going to hear today. But I think there's a lot of sound and fury, but very little substance, and that's what we pretty much suspected almost since the beginning of the Mueller investigation. But when we talk about this issue of electronic surveillance, I thought I would read, when we come back from the break, an individual that has worked in this field and does have some perspective on whether or not there really was at least some kind of spying on the Trump campaign. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
This month is when feminists in America have declared an unofficial holiday known as Equal Pay Day. They argue that women earn less than men. Therefore, in order to catch up with a man's pay from 2018, a woman must work until April. Now, the editors of the Wall Street Journal remind us that the comparison between men's wages and women's wages isn't really accurate when you consider other factors. Women, on average, go into lower-paying fields such as education. Mothers are likelier than men to actually choose flexibility over career advancement. I've cited similar data in previous commentaries that also illustrates the problem of comparing the aggregate data without taking into account other important factors. The editors point to a study by economist Mark Perry of the American Enterprise Institute, who has also suggested that we might want to implement an equal death day. The point that he is making is that men tend to take jobs with a much higher fatality rate. Look at the top 5 most dangerous jobs. Fishery workers have the highest fatality rate. Most are men. Next are lumberjacks, which are 98% male. After that are aircraft pilots, which is a profession that is 94% male. Roofers are 99% male, and garbage collectors are 88% male. Mark Perry's point is simple. When you look at the data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, you discover that men are much more likely to be killed while working. It's also worth mentioning that sometimes the increased risk does not show up in men's paychecks. Logging workers, for example, average $42,000 a year, which isn't much higher than what preschool and kindergarten teachers make. This is just another illustration about the choices men and women make about their jobs based on lots of factors. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From 20th Century Fox and Franklin Entertainment, Breakthrough, starring Chrissy Metz, based on a true story. Breakthrough, rated PG, now playing.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
A lot of attacks have come against the Attorney General, William Barr, and I understand that. And that's just reality because we have such a partisan world today. And one of the reasons I argued from the very beginning that this report should be released is I played the what about if it was the other way around game. And the other way around game would be, what if you had a Democratic president that was being investigated, and then after nearly 2 years of investigation, a democratically appointed attorney general were to give you a 4-page summary? Would the Republicans say, okay, that's enough, and move on? No, they'd want to see the report. Okay, the report's out there now, and as one talk show host said, I love the illustration, he says, now some of those anti-Trumpers are going to be like raccoons digging through the garbage to try to find anything they can possibly eat. You know, there's going to be a desire to try to find some morsel, and with almost 400 pages of content and more than 400 pages with an appendix, they're going to find a few things. And, of course, we've already started seeing some of those show up on the websites and things like that. But the reality is that this really is, as we said before, sound and fury, and is more to talk about. But with that is said, one of the other criticisms of William Barr, not only that he summarized 400 pages in 4 pages, was that he referred the other day to the fact that there had been spying on the Trump campaign. And so in the Hill, which is really supposed to be, and I think usually is, sort of a nonpartisan record of Capitol Hill. So in the Hill, there was an opinion piece written by Kevin Brock. Now, you might say, who is he? I did not know who he was until I heard somebody quote from him. He's the former assistant director of intelligence for the FBI. Well, that's pretty good. Been an FBI special agent for 24 years. He also was the principal deputy director of the National Counterterrorism Center. Well, that's pretty good. And also is the founder of a group called New Street Global Solutions, which deals with public safety, strategic mission, and the rest. This guy, in other words, he's been in the intelligence world, well, longer than anybody we've ever interviewed on this program, and knows of what he speaks. And so he talked about this idea of spying and surveillance. So I just thought I'd read it real quickly because this is, I think, parallel to the Mueller report and illustrates why the Attorney General, who's a pretty smart man and has been around the block, he was the youngest individual that had served many years ago in the FBI and in other venues, and so now has been able to come back almost out of retirement. And one of the things I like about it is he really doesn't care what people say about him. So he's not trying to play the political game. He's actually a little bit older than I am, which that's pretty old. And nevertheless, Kevin Brock says the Attorney General, William Barr, used the S word in front of Congress and the world last week, and organized fainting spells commenced. For example, he said, I believe the government spied on the Trump campaign. And then he said that Mr. Barr, in a town where semantic directness is simply not practiced among the political Pharisees and their pilot fish in the media who seek to preserve a certain order by obfuscating true intent. You gotta love that turn of phrase. Who wrote this? Lathan Watts? I mean, this is great stuff. Okay, his use of the word spy was as blunt as an everyman face. Its stinging connotation, he says, was validated in direct proportion to the contrived outrage of the opposition politicians and cable news mannequins flopping on the ground and clutching their knees like European soccer players. If you've ever seen some of them fall on the ground when they've supposedly been hit. This guy is a great writer. I got to meet him someday. Anyway, he says a few weeks ago, he points out that the former FBI director, Andrew McCabe, stated he believed President Trump was an agent of the Russian government. I think the Mueller report really sets that aside, that he was a spy. And the assertion was met with somber nodding and little, if any, pushback. He made this incredible statement without, according to Barr's summary of the Mueller report, possessing any evidence that it was true. He was, however, in the middle of a book tour and raising cash for the GoFundMe website because, according to him, he's in desperate need of money since the president cut short some of his retirement benefits. His anguish can be seen as he drives around his Tony neighborhood in his luxury car. Thank you for your contributions to this destitute and victimized man. He's having a lot of fun. But nevertheless, he talks about McCabe's fellow traveler in this empty collusion investigation they cooked up and ran. Fired former FBI Director James Comey was quick to seize another opportunity to moralize to a camera the day after the Attorney General Barr used the spy word. I don't know what the heck he's talking about. That's all I can say, apparently James Comey said. Apparently it was not all Comey could say, since he added, when I hear this kind of language used, it's concerning because the FBI and the Department of Justice conduct court-ordered electronic surveillance, and having quite a bit to say, he kept talking, I've never thought of that as spying. As we've talked about with Kelly Shackelford, you can call it surveillance, we'll call it spying, but let's, just call the whole thing off as another line I can use, but I'm borrowing too many lines today. So anyway, James Comey was anxious to echo the narrative advanced by those in opposition to the president that court-order electronic surveillance is somehow different or less distasteful than the untidy, morally fluid concept of spying. Well, here is the point that we now see being made by Kevin Brock, and it's a really good point, because they can seek shelter in the softer surveillance word, but here is what he and McCabe unleashed on an American citizen involved in the outskirts of a presidential campaign. A Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, called FISA, Court-Ordered Electronic Surveillance, allows the FBI leeway to intercept more than telephone and computer communications. It allows the clandestine microphone and camera capture of the target at all times, in all places, even the most intimate of all daily life. It is more intrusive than a Title III criminal wiretap of a drug dealer or a mob boss. I appreciate him telling that, because once you have unleashed one of these surveillance, FISA surveillance, they can, as he's pointing out, have a camera on or a microphone on anywhere. That could be in your bathroom. It could be in your bedroom. It could be in your car. It could be intercepting any or all communication with you or anyone with you, both by cell phone, line, whatever it might be. So in one way, he says Comey is right. A FISA court-ordered electronic surveillance is different than spying. It is the epitome, he says, of government power over an individual's privacy. It is the nuclear option in the world of intelligence collection. Why didn't he write this months ago? I mean, once I read this, I said, this needs to get out. And again, you're probably hearing this for the very first time here on Point of View. And it is indeed used appropriately against foreign nationals actively spying on U.S. interest, and yes, even U.S. citizens who hold security clearances and possess national security information and demonstrate a willingness to turn over such information to another country. However, a FISA order until now has never been used by an FBI director or deputy director to intercept an individual with no clearances and no obvious access to sensitive information who happens to be involved in a presidential campaign. This is a one-off, if you can understand what he's trying to say. Never happened before. Let's hope it never happens again. One would think then that Comey and McCabe would have had darn sure that the reasons provided to the FISA court to intercept Trump campaign advisor Carter Page would be incredibly compelling and build on a solid foundation of facts. Instead, by their own admission, they relied mostly on a Russian-influenced dossier, that's the so-called Steele dossier, the source and funding of which they did not fully disclose to the court, a dossier that James Comey himself described as salacious and unverified, and yet it still signed off on several renewals of the intrusive interception of Page. Incredibly, on the day he was fired, Comey maintained that he still didn't know if there was anything to the collusion investigation he initiated between the Trump campaign and Russia, and the silly semantical jousting over spying versus surveillance is a distraction. The real concern among the collusionists, as he calls it, is that indeed that the Attorney General Barr has launched his own reveal into the origins of Comey and McCabe's investigation of the Trump campaign. This is entirely appropriate, given the suggestions that they acted improperly with political bias on the thinnest of information. Such a review could lead to some extremely uncomfortable days for those who have favored leveraging the powerful authorities of government for the benefit of one political party over another. And Mr. Barr added one other very important point. He stated he wasn't launching an investigation of the FBI per se. He says, I think there was probably a failure among the group of leaders there in the upper echelon. Just as blunt, but perhaps an understatement of the year. As Kelly Shackelford has said, if you ever looked at the Justice Department building, and I've walked by it many times before, we're not talking about all the people down in the first couple of floors. We're talking about the people on the very top floor, the upper echelon, those individuals that allowed for electronic surveillance. So the next time you see somebody making a distinction between spying and surveillance, say, that's true. There is a difference between spying and surveillance. Surveillance is the epitome. It's the nuclear option of intelligence gathering, and that's what was unleashed on people in the Trump campaign. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, of course, the Mueller report has been released, and if you would like to read it, simply go to our website, or you can find links at just about any website now, and you can read it in its entirety, recognizing that some of it is redacted, but you can still get a pretty good idea, and none of these redactions strike me as being anything other than just removing some relevant information about an ongoing investigation, but again, we'll hear some parts about that as well. But for just a minute, I want to come back to something that I just mentioned a minute ago, and this was this piece by Kevin Brock. And it illustrates a conversation that we had just the other day in a staff meeting where at one point somebody said, we sometimes hear at Point of View, especially during our Truth Team Week, say that we cover issues that nobody else covers. Is that really fair? Because after all, you do see some of these issues like the Mueller report being covered, and we're not the only people talking about that today. But let me just go back to the story I just read, and two more I'm going to read in just a minute. And I would suggest to you, yes, we do cover a lot of things that just don't get covered anywhere else. Take this one that I just read from a minute ago, Kevin Brock. The only talk show that I think even mentioned this, and I want to give credit where credit is due, is Mark Levin did mention it and read a little bit from it in The Hill. This to me is kind of groundbreaking. There is a real difference between spying and surveillance, and I think he educated all of us. How many people have heard about that? Probably very few. And so that is one story that we today covered that you probably don't hear anywhere else. Let me cover another one. There were questions raised as we saw the cathedral burning in France. Was this an accident or was it intentional? Now, I will take at face value the argument that it was an accident. Since there were renovations taking place, you can see how a spark, a settling torch, or anything could have set it off. But it is at least relevant, I think, to talk about the fact that there have been all sorts of fires set in churches by Muslims. The other day, when someone tried to bring that up on a Fox News show, they just shut them down. They literally turned the microphones off. So, for just a minute, I want to tell you what didn't get covered even on what many people think to be a relatively conservative news outlet. Because this particular article here says, while French authorities believe the blaze that destroyed the roof of the 850-year-old Notre Dame Cathedral was accidental, it has brought attention to the surge of attacks on Christian symbols in Europe. These are some numbers you probably don't hear too many places because they turn the microphones off when people start talking about these. Nearly 2,000 Christian houses of worship in France have been desecrated in the past 2 years, according to police. In Germany, there were 4 such incidents just in the month of March. Some French politicians have attributed the church desecrations, average more than 2 a day, to what they call militant secularism. So it could be due to Muslims, it could be due to atheists, but nevertheless, the response is kind of interesting because the individual that I'm going to quote from is somebody who's been on the program with us, Raymond Ibrahim, with the Gatestone Institute. And he says in virtually every attack across Europe, authorities and media obfuscate the identities of the vandals. In other words, they cloud them over. He says in those rare instances where Muslim or migrant identity of the destroyers is leaked, the desecrators are then presented as suffering from mental health issues. So whenever it happens, most of the time they don't identify the perpetrators. When some of those leak out and we find out they're Muslims, they're almost always attributed to mental health issues. Okay. Well, again, Raymond Ibrahim, who's been on with us before, cited an analysis by one website that said, quote, hardly anyone writes and speaks about the increasing attacks on Christian symbols. There is an eloquent silence in both France and Germany about the scandal of the desecrations and the origin of their perpetrators. Authorities avoid at all costs blaming migrants. And then they go on, quote, it is not the perpetrators who are in danger of being ostracized, but those who dare to associate the desecration of Christian symbols with immigrant imports. They are accused of hatred, hate speech, and racism. Now, again, I'll take at face value the fact that this was perhaps an accident in the cathedral that was burned, and I suspect that it will be rebuilt and maybe even in a better situation where there'll be a lot less wood, and the likelihood of that happening again will be even less. But again, this is, I think, a relevant issue that even if this was not due to any kind of attack from secular groups or from Muslim groups, it is not surprising in what has been taking place in that country for some time. They go on to talk about some attacks that have included a fire in another church in Paris where human waste was smeared on the wall of one of those individuals, where there was a vandalizing of an organ in another basilica outside of Paris. And in most cases, the fire that was actually set in one of those areas was probably started deliberately. But it's not only the church, it's part of who we are, said the individuals that were part of that community. And there has been what they call a code of silence that has been taking place for some time. So again, this is just another kind of illustration that I'm going to try to make from time to time. I really, roll my eyes sometimes when you have some ministry saying, we're the only people in the world doing this. No, probably not. There are all sorts of mission groups, there are all sorts of Christians doing all sorts of things. But at the same time, sometimes it's just helpful to realize that when I think legitimately questioning, well, are we really covering things that others aren't? Yes, there are times when we are covering stories that are steadfastly prevented from being covered by anyone else simply because of the reality that we are dealing with an attempt to just try not to ruffle people's feathers. So there's just a couple of ideas, but I thought I'd add one more just before we take a break, and that is just an illustration again that even when you talk about Christian radio, sometimes Christian radio doesn't always cover some of the stories that we cover here on Point of View. And this has to do with a story that just came out a couple of days ago. The title of the article is Christian Radio K-Love Refuses to Air Unplanned Ads for Being Too Political. The article here says the Christian radio network, K-Love, found itself in hot water when executives at the company blocked commercials for the pro-life movie Unplanned. The PureFlix film tells the story, as we've talked about on this program before, of Abby Johnson, a former Planned Parenthood clinic director who parted with the organization after she watched a doctor perform an abortion via ultrasound. And in late March, Abby Johnson revealed that the Christian radio network had banned ads for Unplanned, claiming that the content was too political. So Abby Johnson urged her Facebook followers to reach out to K-Love. And soon thereafter, the radio conglomerate doubled down on its decision, noting that the company focuses on the positive and encouraging content that is safe for the whole family. And the sticking point for K-Love was the film's R rating. Well, Abby Johnson wouldn't put up with that. She responded by saying, actually, she said some things that I probably wouldn't say on the air, but nevertheless, arguing that the radio network promoted the Passion of the Christ, which was also rated R. They can't seem to be able to keep track of what they stand for. So one day after Johnson's initial post criticizing K-Love, she posted an update suggesting the radio company had changed its tune. After meeting again today with one of the Unplanned producers, she said K-Love Radio has decided to stand up for the unborn and promote Unplanned. But in a tweet posted at least last Friday, Johnson said that K-Love is still not airing advertisements for the pro-life movie, which, of course, debuted in March. And guess what? It's April now, so I don't know that it's going to do a lot of good. So if you every once in a while wonder when we make the statement, do you really cover things that other people don't cover? Yes, we did. We talked about the difference between spying and surveillance. We talked about the fact that there have been more than 2,000 attacks on Christian houses of worship in France in the last couple of years, which apparently was just a little too controversial for even people at Fox to cover. And then we actually have people like Abby Johnson, who the actual movie is about, as well as the producer of Unplanned on the program. And so far, we haven't even seen any ads that the K-Love Christian Radio Network will air to actually promote that movie. So yes, we do cover some things that nobody else covers, and we're going to continue to do that. And if anything else, that's one of the reasons why I hope maybe you'll even think about going to our website today, pointofview.net. There's a button there that says join the team. And even a one-time gift would be your way of saying, I'm glad you cover some stories that other radio networks, and even other news outlets simply don't cover. And that's what we do here at Point of View. Of course, we're also covering something everybody else has been covering, and that, of course, has been what? Of course, the Mueller report. Just before we come back, finish off this hour, I did want to spend a little bit of time maybe answering some of the questions some of you ask about Easter and those kinds of things. Thought it would be a way to lighten it up before we get into our conversations in the next couple of hours. So we'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that in the next hour, we're going to be talking about the arsonist in the office. Pete Havel will be with us, and then Jerry Tuma will be in studio with us as well in the hour after that. Talk about the economy. We'll talk about debt. We'll talk about the stock market, and then just get ready for this very special Easter weekend. In just a minute, I'm going to answer some of the questions people have about Easter, but I thought I might point you to one of the articles by Conrad Black, A Reckoning is in Store for the Democrats, in which, of course, as they point out, this whole issue that we've been talking about has been the justification up until now for why you should elect a Democrat, because you have this Russian collusion argument, which is kind of falling apart. And then, of course, you've had people attacking the Attorney General, William Barr, but I just don't think that one goes too very far as well. And so there are going to be individuals that are going to still try to pursue that in terms of whether or not maybe there wasn't collusion, but there was obstruction. So we'll be hearing about that. But the bottom line is that we also have a presidential campaign unfolding as well. And so skipping over some of the initial things he said about the FISA warrant, about the Mueller report, about the response to Attorney General William Barr, then this particular piece by Conrad Black takes us back to what he calls the numberless candidates for the Democratic presidential nomination will go to extremes to sidestep the whole Trump impeachment issue. But the credibility of the Democratic Party, given the total immersion into this, of course, is going to be a problem because they have really set themselves up for a little bit of difficulty. What he calls hilarious extremes. You could talk about hypocrisy. You can use your phrase. But the point is then he says, Kirsten Gillibrand, who has done and said absolutely nothing to merit consideration as president, has launched and sunk down slipwise beneath the waves. Her candidacy has attracted zero report. Most of the other candidates are not doing well. Cory Booker, perhaps the most compulsively verbose candidate since Hubert Humphrey, is apparently full of goodwill but inadequate. Kamala Harris seems to have been the makings of a good candidate, but she's already tangled in kind of the leftward nonsense of open borders, socialized medicine, high taxes, and green terror. And then you have Beto O'Rourke, as foreseen after a brief flurry, doesn't seem to be doing that well. Elizabeth Warren is everyone's nightmare of a severe, humorless kindergarten teacher, he says, but will not recover from her masquerade as a native Indian. And Amy Klobuchar is sensible and seems likable and actually might have been somebody that could have been one of those sort of moderate candidates, but nevertheless has no pizzazz and hasn't made any inroads. So all of a sudden, you're back to basically Bernie and Biden. And there are even some people that they're talking about here that are trying to prevent Bernie Sanders from getting the nomination for fear that that would be handing any kind of a re-election back to Donald Trump. And then we can also, of course, talk about the flavor of the month right now, which is Mayor Peter Buttigieg. But again, he's 37. He's been a mayor of a really small city. This would be a good stepping stone if you were going to be a member of Congress, maybe even a senator, but probably not president. And so there are still a lot of people that wonder whether or not Joe Biden could win the nomination. But either way, you have an old white guy, Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden, running against an old white guy, Donald Trump. And it will be kind of interesting to see how that plays itself out. So I wanted to just commend that to you. It does a very good job of analyzing the candidates, the circumstances, and even some of the negative impact of the Mueller report and some of the wild speculation that took place. But just before we get into our national hour, which we will start in just a few minutes, I thought I might answer a couple of Easter questions that some of you have posed to us. One of the questions people have asked is, why does Easter fall on April 21st this year? This is one of the latest. And really, again, gets you back to history a little bit. The date of Easter was set back in AD 325 at the Council of Nicaea. Easter was set for the first Sunday after the first full moon occurring on or after the vernal equinox. Well, the vernal equinox is usually on March 20th or 21st, but the full moon can vary significantly. So it's possible that Easter could happen between March 22nd or April 25th. So that's why Easter is so late this year, simply due to a decision made back in the 4th century at the Council of Nicaea. Why do we call it Easter? Well, it turns out that the Frankish Church, those would be the Germans who settled in Rome during the 5th century, celebrated the resurrection of Jesus. And the celebration of the resurrection oftentimes was due to those individuals, those during the resurrection festival wore white robes, and the word Alba is the German word for white, one of those at least. It's also the word for sunrise. When the name of the festival was translated into German, the sunrise meaning was Ostern, which you can see how eventually Ostern became Easter, and that's where we get the name Easter today. And then just a couple of funny questions here. Why do we have an Easter bunny? And again, some historical sources suggest that the Easter bunny tradition arrived with the German immigrants that came to America in the 1700s, who settled in Pennsylvania. They had a tradition of an egg-laying hare named Osterhaus, and the children made nests, and they had this creature with colored eggs. And so eventually we ended up with Easter baskets, Easter eggs, and of course, one of the favorite of Nick Pitt's yesterday, which he probably mentioned again, were peeps. He just loves those peeps. But finally, why do we have Easter eggs? I've had individuals sometimes say, what does, the resurrection have to do with Easter or Easter eggs or Easter bunnies? Well, it turns out that Easter egg tradition actually probably was linked to pagan traditions, but there's also at least one tradition that goes back to some of the church traditions, and that is, interestingly enough, if you go back to about the 13th century, there was actually the idea that during Lent, and many of you may be practicing Lent right now, eggs were kind of a forbidden fruit, or a forbidden food, I should say. And so sometimes the people would paint and decorate those eggs, and then after this period of penance and fasting, on Easter, they would eat those eggs as a celebration. So that may be where some of those odd traditions come from. I would rather not celebrate Easter, other than we still are kind of forced to use the word, but to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And of course, that's one of the things we certainly want to challenge you to do this coming weekend. And if you are not a regular church attender, let me encourage you to find a church that teaches the Word of God and to go and to celebrate Easter and the resurrection of Jesus. And in so doing, also to consider whether or not you might just join that church and make a regular church attendance something that you would do, so that you and your family would benefit from the great Bible teaching that takes place in many churches around the country. But let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to give just a real brief update for all of the people that are not familiar with what's happened today in the Mueller Report. But then we'll have in studio with us Pete Havel, and he is the author of the book, The Arsonist in the Office. And that is a book that I thought would be kind of fun, since we spend so much time in the workforce every single day, and our place of work can be a good place to work because of the nice people around us, but sometimes it can be a really horrible place because of individuals who have very awful personalities. So we'll learn about how to handle some of that. And then Jerry Tuma will be with us in the following hour from 2 to 3 Central, and we're going to be talking about the economy. The May edition of the Outlook magazine is actually on debt, not only government debt, but personal debt. So we'll get into that, talk about the stock market, talk about China, and talk about a number of other things that might affect your financial well-being. So I hope that you'll take the time to be with us during the next 2 hours. If you'd like to know a little bit more about some of the things we're going to be talking about, they're all available at our website, pointofview.net. And let me challenge you to click on that button that says Join the Team Now. We need to hear from you. And as we've said, we try to cover things that maybe you only hear right here on Point of View. We'll be right back.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate 2 replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. They're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. This is a very interesting day, in large part because the Mueller report has been released. And as you well know, we haven't spent a lot of time talking about it, so we won't spend a lot of time talking about it today. But let's, if we can, at least cover what we can say about that. Of course, we had the summary of the report, which was about 4 pages long, by the Attorney General William Barr. And many people said, well, that's not enough. And one of the arguments I made is probably not. Because, as I've said before, just turn it around. Imagine if you had a Democratic president who then, after almost 2 years of investigation and the report comes out, you had a democratically appointed attorney general giving you a 4-page summary. Would the Republicans say, okay, I guess that's it? You know that wouldn't be the case. So I think we had to obviously have the report released, which it is. It is redacted. Now, again, the content's about 300-plus pages, but the actual report itself, by the time you get the appendices and everything, is more than 400 pages. And so as a result, you can read it. We have a link on our own website, and I took the time to scan through every one of those pages. You can go fairly deep into the first few pages before there's any redaction at all. When there are redactions, most of them seem pretty common sense because they have some kind of ongoing investigation they don't want compromised. I will admit sometimes you get to a whole page that's redacted, but by and large you can have a chance to read quite a bit. And of course what's going to happen is I think most people are going to probably come to the same conclusion that we heard today from the Attorney General. The Attorney General got in front of the American people, and I was expecting this to go a long time, and it didn't. You know, basically said after 2 years of investigation of the special counsel, actually did confirm that Russian meddling took place in the campaign, but no evidence of any collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. Later on, he even said the special counsel found no evidence that any Americans, including anyone associated with the Trump campaign, conspired or coordinated with the Russian government or with the IRA, which is the Internet Research Agency, which is a Russian group of hackers. And so in some respects, it illustrates one of the points we've made before with at least comments to Macbeth. This was a lot of sound and fury signifying nothing. Maybe it signifies something, but very little. Over 500 interviews, 22 months. Special Counsel Robert Mueller assembled a document after this investigation. There were 8 convictions, none of them having to do with collusion. And we can spend a lot of time talking about it, but we haven't spent a lot of time talking about it before, and we're not going to spend much time talking about it since. Over the next couple of days, we'll see whether or not there are other things that individuals will pull out of the report to make a big deal. We can recognize that we have learned a few things, one of which is the president himself was very frustrated by this. At one point felt maybe this was the end of his presidency. And so we're learning sort of behind-the-scenes kinds of things. But in terms of whether there's any collusion, no. Is there any obstruction? No. But there are 10 places that at least people that have been sitting down counting it in which the president is expressing his opinion about something. And so you're going to hear some people trying to say, well, this is evidence of witness tampering or trying to, in one way or another, influence this. And so we'll hear where that goes. But no reason to spend any more time talking about it today because I have 2 in-studio guest, and I am privileged to spend some time with them today so that we can give you some things that will be very helpful especially in this first hour, in your workforce and in your place of employment. And that is, we bring to the microphone Pete Havel, who is the author of this new book called The Arsonist in the Office. We have information about it on the website. Matter of fact, a link to that website. He's been an experienced lobbyist as well as a political consultant and worked in a lot of different venues, working with groups like the Chamber of Commerce and National Federation of Independent Business, as well as many others. He has a bachelor's degree in business administration from Baylor University and a graduate of the Institute for Organizational Management, and joins me now in studio. Pete, thanks for being with us today.
Great to be here. I wonder if I lost the entire audience when you called me a lobbyist.
Well, we're hoping that we didn't lose the whole audience when we talked about the Mueller report, because I think some of our listeners don't care about it anymore. Those that do will have many opportunities in the future to talk about that. And, of course, if you say, okay, I really want to speak to some of the issues there's 400 pages. It's on the website. Start reading, and we'll get back to that opportunity in the future. I've worked as a lobbyist in the state legislature, not in this state, but in other states, so I can fully appreciate that as well. But let's, if we can, talk about this book, because it's 21 chapters plus an appendix. And I think one of the things I wanted to have you on is that we spend an enormous amount of our time every day in the workplace. And a workplace can be a great place to go if you're around a team of people that all love you and appreciate you. But all it takes is I used to use the phrase, one of these irregular people to make life pretty miserable. Or if you have a boss that isn't necessarily up to speed on some of the requirements of what is or is not allowed in terms of religious liberty, in terms of sexual harassment, or in terms of intimidation. This can be a nightmare, and that's why you talk about the arsonist in the office, right?
That's right. It comes from an experience that I had in the workplace, and I found myself having worked for years and years with some incredible organizations, and found myself pretty confident that I could handle anything. I'd worked with politicians over the years,
yes.
Big egos, big agendas, and the deals we were talking about were in the tens of billions of dollars when a decision was being made. And I had people in my face. When I worked in campaigns, been hit with protest signs. I thought I could deal with anything until I found myself in a culture within an organization that had pretty much turned over all their standards of behavior to the lowest common denominator within the organization.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the person that they called the arsonist.
Yes.
And it was that employee that burned things down and lit things up.
Yes.
And when they did, the trouble started.
The first part of your book talks about the warning signs of a toxic environment. Just give us a few, because even your own experience, I think, illustrates how some of our listeners right now say, you're describing my place of work. Talk about that.
Absolutely. Gossip within the organization, which is, all of us love to talk about different things, but the level of gossip is a problem. How is conflict treated? Is it buried, or is it addressed when there's just passion about an issue? What happens when you've got good people in the organization that just kind of disappear one day?
Yes.
And you go back and start talking.
I've seen that, by the way.
Absolutely.
Even in ministry, I've seen that. Probably even more so in ministry, because we don't want a scandal. So how that goes. Yeah.
And it tends to be when it's the good people. They had a pretty good reason why they were leaving, and that they couldn't take it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I have 20 of them in the book and could talk about that chapter all day. But and the other one is when you're in meetings and something's being discussed and no one is saying a word.
Yeah, they're all looking around.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they've likely learned that saying something is going to get them in trouble, and they get to the point of, why bother?
Yeah, that's right. And so, again, some really good illustrations there. So when we come back, I want to talk about some of these specifics. So if you're an employee, and most of us find ourselves in that job description, you're certainly going to appreciate this. If you're a manager or a CEO, you're really going to benefit from some of the things we're going to talk about today. And that's why we have information about this book, which I think you're going to find very helpful. We also have a link on the website, and we'll talk about that. And if you would like to have Pete come and speak to your group, I suspect you're going to be doing a few Chamber of Commerce chicken dinners coming up here, don't you think, pretty soon?
I need to go on a diet right now.
Yeah, so again, we'll have a great opportunity to learn from him this hour. Jerry Tuma will be with us the next hour as we're going to be talking about finances and the federal debt and China and all sorts of other things. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
This month is when feminists in America have declared an unofficial holiday known as Equal Pay Day. They argue that women earn less than men. Therefore, in order to catch up with a man's pay from 2018, a woman must work until April. Now, the editors of the Wall Street Journal remind us that the comparison between men's wages and women's wages isn't really accurate when you consider other factors. Women, on average, go into lower paying fields such as education. Mothers are likelier than men to actually choose flexibility over career advancement. I've cited similar data in previous commentaries that also illustrates the problem of comparing the aggregate data without taking into account other important factors. The editors point to a study by economist Mark Perry of the American Enterprise Institute, who has also suggested that we might want to implement an equal death day. The point that he is making is that men tend to take jobs with a much higher fatality rate. Look at the top 5 most dangerous jobs. Fishery workers have the highest fatality rate. Most are men. Next are lumberjacks, which are 98% male. After that are aircraft pilots, which is a profession that is 94% male. Roofers are 99% male, and garbage collectors are 88% male. Mark Perry's point is simple. When you look at the data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, you discover that men are much more likely to be killed while working. It's also worth mentioning that sometimes the increased risk does not show up in men's paychecks. Logging workers, for example, average $42,000 a year, which isn't much higher than what preschool and kindergarten teachers make. This is just another illustration about the choices men and women make about their jobs based on lots of factors. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From 20th Century Fox and Franklin Entertainment, Breakthrough, starring Chrissy Metz, based on a true story. Breakthrough, rated PG, now playing.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Havel with us, and we're talking about his book, The Arsonist in the Office, Fireproofing Your Life Against Toxic Coworkers, Bosses, Employees, and Cultures. You should be able to find the book in your local bookstore, but we also have a link to petehavel.com/The Arsonist in the Office. You don't have to remember all that. Just simply click on his picture. There is a newsletter sign-up, which we'll talk about a little bit later. You also find a place where you can contact him. It may be somebody you would like to have come and speak for your particular group. And so whether we're talking about a business or a ministry or a church, whatever it might be, I think so many of these issues apply. And one of those is in chapter 4, because it has to do with this issue of sexual harassment. Now, Pete, we've just have covered this issue before in one of our Outlook magazines. Penna Dexter wrote the piece on the hashtag #MeToo movement. And so we also recognize that we have a political campaign right now where at least one of the political candidates tends to be a little friendlier than others, and that's become an issue. And it's not a good image to have within a company, a corporation, certainly within a Christian ministry or a business. So help us kind of figure out how to make our way through, on the one hand, kind of this liberal hashtag #MeToo movement, but on the other hand, recognize that, you know, as Christians, we can give affirmation and hugs, but we have to be really careful about how we do it and what we do.
Absolutely. And it's that line between being helpful and handsy that we don't want to cross. Sexual harassment is a tough issue right now, in that in some cases it's undefined in terms of exactly what it is, and that is causing some confusion in the workplace.
Sure.
You also have, frankly, organizations that for years, whether it be corporations or churches, you name it, some looked the other way for a long time. And so when the Me Too movement came out and was saying there were wrongs that need to be righted, there was some truth in that, I believe. Where I believe where we've gotten to is a situation in the debate of the battle between the sexes, and hopefully there'll be a peace treaty in there somewhere at some point, is where we entered really during the time around the Kavanaugh hearings, where you began the discussion of believe all women. And frankly, I firmly believe that any charge by a woman in a workplace of any type of wrongdoing ought to be investigated and taken seriously. And if there has been harassment, defined harassment, you need to take care of that person that has been targeting someone. But we can't go in. We don't believe as a nation that anyone is guilty from the outset, and that we really need to have a discussion about having those types of standards, because, and we're starting to see this even quoted in the New York Times and other publications that tend to be a bit more on the liberal side. You're having some situations now where, and I'm not necessarily saying I agree with this, but I understand how people get to this point. You're seeing businesses, especially in small to medium size, that are owned by men or predominantly managed by men, that are beginning to say, you know what, from a risk management standpoint, here we are from a business standpoint, that perhaps if we have two candidates and it's a jump ball in their qualifications, that the man will be easier because we won't have the Me Too concerns. As a dad of a 15-year-old who's going to be entering the workforce, I don't want her having to deal with that. I want it to be based on the qualifications. But there's a lot of things going on right now that are causing some problems, and I would love to see some clarity. Move out the extreme voices and take the people in the middle that are dealing with these things, the reasonable folks that make decisions every day, and get them involved. And I think we can find some common ground.
And especially when you're dealing with, say, churches or church ministries that deal with young people, this is a little different harassment, but it's, again, if you hear something about abuse, you have a duty to report. So I certainly want to mention that issue as well. But since you mentioned hiring, that gets to the chapter on fireproofing your hiring policy, because, again, there are all sorts of well-meaning Christians listening right now that are doing hiring, and there's certain questions you can ask and certain questions you better never ask, and there's just all sorts of issues in terms of the law and morality. How do you kind of find your way through that one?
Sure. And to a certain extent, anytime you're talking about, religion for one, you probably don't want to be crossing that line because you start getting into sticky issues, asking people pointedly personal questions. You don't want to do that. But to avoid a toxic person, somebody that's going to cause real damage to the values of the organization, to the camaraderie of the organization, there are some great questions that you can ask. Asking somebody what they think of their last boss will get you some interesting answers, in that some people don't have a filter. Having more than one person do the screening. Okay. Joe down the hall interviewed them and he didn't catch a problem, but Joanne in next office over, okay, she's getting a vibe that somebody is going to be trouble because they said X, Y, and Z. Those types of things. And I'll give you a great anecdote. The CEO of Charles Schwab, Walt Bettinger, when he is hiring a senior executive, he invites them to breakfast. Now, I'm guessing the guys these days that they're invited to breakfast by him know the drill. But what he did for a long time, and he talked about this in an interview, was to get there 15 minutes early, talk to the waiter or waitress, and say, when this person comes in sitting across from me, mess up their order. Put in cheese in their omelet, or what, they didn't ask for cheese. Do something, because he wanted to find out what was going to happen. How would they react? Did they treat that person with respect? Were they a jerk? Those types of things.
What a great line.
You get a little bit of a real world type of knowledge at that point that you might not get when they're a little bit more buttoned down during an interview.
And back to your premise here, that sometimes you have an arsonist in the office, but you also talk about that there's the arsonist apprentice. So in the hiring, you want to make sure that if you've already got one troublemaker, you don't want somebody else who either is a natural troublemaker or easily seduced and brought under the wing of the troublemaker and make your problem twice as bad as it was just a few days ago.
No doubt. And I talk about the episode of Star Trek, the Tribbles episode, that where you started with one little problem of a cute little animal, and then they multiplied. They were like the gremlins that would come out at night and cause problems. You do that in an organization as well. You bring in a little bit of trouble, expect more trouble. There's actually studies that say, and I think it's in the financial services world, that you bring somebody in who has been fined for some sort of malfeasance, some type of sanctioned behavior at some point. There's about a 40% uptick in bad behavior from the people around them.
Wow.
So it spreads. It's much like a virus. It's much like anything else. You know, we saw it in the schoolyard growing up. If somebody didn't get in trouble for, punching the kid next to them on in the kickball game, they didn't get in trouble for that. Other kids are going to get the message that bad behavior is okay, and it's not that different in the working world.
And you've heard the old phrase, a bad apple in the barrel, and that was long before people were like Peter Drucker writing about leadership and things like that. I mean, our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents recognized that sometimes you would hope that bringing a good person into an environment would influence them in the positive way. Sometimes it does. But even more so, a bad person, bad company corrupts good morals is, of course, one of the phrases in the scriptures. And it's just, again, recognizing that if you think you got problems right now with an arsonist in the office, just get an arsonist apprentice, and it gets to be a whole wildfire, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And what you are forced to, and this is where managers face real dilemmas, is if you have to deal with this person and you're told you can't get rid of them.
Yes.
And that's actually what I talk about in the book. My experience in dealing with a managerial structure that had decided we have an employee that's causing all sorts of problems, but we're more scared of what they may do outside the organization coming at us externally than from what they'll do on the inside. So, Pete, welcome to the company. They're your problem now, and hope you enjoy it here.
Well, and again, the other problem is sometimes they can't be removed because they might work in government. They might be in education where the chances of firing an individual are kind of slim and none. So that is the case. Let me just mention, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation today with Pete. And if you'd like to ask a question, 1-800-351-1212, or if you just want to sit back and take some notes, and I would recommend that you do, you're going to benefit from some of this. And we'll talk about, when we get back here, some of the cost of a toxic workforce. We've already talked about that a little bit, but get into that a little bit more, and some of the tips to avoid that in the future. But we also have a link to his website, and we'll come back. We'll talk about some of the resources on the website, as we oftentimes do. PeteHavel.com/The Arsonist in the Office. You don't have to remember all that, because all you have to do is click on where his picture is. We also have a link to his Twitter account and his Facebook account. So if you'd like to know more about him, that is the case. And the book is available both in paperback and in Kindle. So if you find yourself saying, this is the kind of book I really need, especially in my office, and if you're in a position of management, I don't see how you could survive without getting this book. So again, it's available to you on our website, pointofview.net. As you go there, I hope you'll also click on some of the other buttons there, one of which allows you to join with us in terms of finances, to join the team. So click on that button because, again, we're talking about some issues that will help you in the workforce and help you in your Christian walk. We're going to take a break, come back with more right after this.
Question: do you have a health insurance plan you are not happy with? Well, Bethany and Jason thought they were stuck. Their plan just kept getting more expensive, and Bethany's favorite doctor didn't even take that plan anymore. And then some friends at church told them about MediShare.
With our previous insurance, we were paying $1,200 a month. With MediShare, we now pay around $600 a month.
Yes, they're paying $600 less per month, and that's a pretty typical savings with MediShare. And they actually like MediShare more.
I was able to go back to my original doctor that I absolutely loved, and it's just been an absolutely beautiful thing being a part of MediShare.
Yeah, so they pay a lot less, and they like it more. No wonder MediShare is growing so fast. Find out more. They're super easy to talk to. All you have to do is call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212, talking about the arsonist in the office. And again, that is the title of the book, and you can certainly find out more by going to the website. And Pete, when I go to your website, there's information about you, about the book, media, newsletter, blog, and all the rest. But I would hope if people are saying, this is something I think we need to deal with in our church, in our Christian organization, in our business. You know, not only am I a deacon, as you well know, in church, and this is the kind of thing that I think would be helpful for churches. I've also sit on various boards. I could see sometimes we've got some dysfunction taking place there, or I don't necessarily know how to handle some of these problems. I know you're available for some of that, aren't you?
Absolutely. Doing a lot of speaking on that. Spoke to a couple groups just last week on the topic that are dealing with rogue employees.
Yes. Boy.
Much like the arsonist. So yeah, absolutely. If folks want to reach me, they can call me at my number 855-NO-ARSON.
Yeah, 855-NO-ARSON. I've even got the card here, so that's pretty fun to do that as well. So again, Pete Havel with us, and again, the book is entitled The Arsonist in the Office, and I mentioned just a minute ago, we want to talk about, I guess it's chapter 10, the cost of a toxic workplace. You can, from personal experience, talk about that, but since you've written about this, you've got all sorts of anecdotal stories as well. But what are some of the costs?
No doubt. And people normally think when you hear about a toxic workplace, it's just people yelling at each other, screaming matches in the boardroom, that type of thing.
Yeah.
But there is substantial damage that happens. And I frame it in the book. A lot of what I do either comes from either sports or my political career, those types of things. But as I was putting this together, I found an acronym that worked for me, and that is my daughter, who's now 15. She's going to be very embarrassed when she hears about this, but she loved this silly putty stuff called Flarp.
Flarp.
And it's kind of like silly putty, but it's slimy, and when you pull it out, it makes a flatulent sound. It's horrible.
Yeah.
And
but that stands for finances, legal matters, attraction and retention of employees, reputation, productivity. It was just a great chapter there.
That's right. And you know, the finances. You look at a company. I mean, we all remember what happened with Harvey Weinstein. With him, not only doing horrible things, but he also took down his investors, his employees. He bankrupted the company.
Yeah.
On the legal side, you're starting to see very high-profile, embarrassing lawsuits coming out of toxic situations just about every week. My Google alerts blow up on that. Attraction and retention of employees. Who wants to stand around when you're being abused?
Oh,
and
sure.
In a 4%, 3.8% unemployment rate type of job market,
they're going to be leaving.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No
Don't
doubt.
let the door hit you on the way out, as they oftentimes say. They're gone.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
On the reputational side, you name it. I mentioned Wells Fargo in the book that got hit for their scandal when managers were pushing their sales guys to essentially make fake accounts. And that's bad managerial behavior. It's toxic, and it
breeds.
The government and everyone else.
It's
Absolutely.
like the triples again, you know. Yeah, all of a sudden it goes, you know, and it just goes everywhere, and you don't think that one bad apple is going to ruin the barrel, but it is very, very true. Okay, the question that a lot of people have is, but we have an HR department, and that gets us into, I love the title here, HR in Toxic Environments, Putting Gasoline on the Fire. I thought this was like the neutral Sweden in World War II or something like that. You came to find out that the HR department sometimes could be the problem rather than the solution, right?
Absolutely, or at the very least, just as much of a problem as whatever else is going on. And people need to understand, I found this interesting as I was putting together the book. I would ask my friends in HR, and this is not an HR bashing book, but like anywhere else, you better know your surroundings if you're going to survive. That HR departments, human resources departments, are under the same pressures everybody else is in an organization. They are there to protect, certainly to help employees where possible, but they're there to help the objectives of the senior leadership. And that's great if the senior executives are doing the right things. But if they're not, and employees want to push back against that, they're going to find out very, very quickly. that they may have just cost themselves their career.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen every day. Doesn't happen in every organization. There's phenomenal HR departments, but you find yourself in the wrong organization and you want to raise the red flag that you've got problems over here, they may show you what they think of your problems.
Yes. Well, and again, whether it's Enron, which got lots of visibility, or some of these others, of course, you're talking about Wells Fargo as one other illustration, just that there are situations that surface, and it's going to get us into something we'll talk about in just a few minutes, and that's the whole issue of whistleblowers. But I try to go through this as best I can in order, and one of the other ones was fireproofing your career. By now, some of the listeners are going, okay, yeah, I'm in a situation like that, and how do I, if indeed we have all sorts of very significant issues going on, and you're talking about the arsonist in the office, and you're talking about fireproofing, how can I fireproof myself? What can I or not can I do to actually be protected from some of the, if you will, backfire or backlash that takes place as a result of some of these issues unfolding in the workforce?
Absolutely. And I played a lot of sports. A lot of things I say are in sports analogies. This is a little bit of offense and a little bit of defense.
Yeah.
On the offensive side, know that most of the arsonists in the office, the people that are causing problems, one of their motivations is they're ambitious.
Yeah.
They may want your job.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you need to do is, first and foremost, and this is pretty intuitive, but you better be a high performer.
Yeah.
You better be just as successful as they are. You also, and here's a political thing that I learned years ago, you better be telling your story. People need to understand your value in the organization. You need to find a specialty. We always had somebody in one office I worked in years ago. They were the only person that understood Excel, that Microsoft program. That person was bulletproof for the rest of their life because no one else knew what they were doing. Find that specialty that's out there that you know that you're valued for, that is going to give you a connection to the company for a long time. Another thing, if you're being challenged in your job, never let lies about you, things that are hurting your reputation, go unanswered, because you're going to find that people are just busy.
Yeah.
And they, to a certain extent, they may not believe it from the outset, but if you create a vacuum where there's nothing but lies on the table, you may find yourself having those lies believed, and depending upon what they are, that may hurt you badly.
And the old environment, when, say, George W. Bush was president and did not respond to some of the lies being said about him, you could probably get away with that. But in the current environment, where there is probably never a statement made about President Donald Trump that he didn't respond to, now, even more so than then, if you don't respond to it, they just assume you're guilty. So
Absolutely.
There is a sense in which we've almost changed the culture around us so that the business culture almost demands that you respond, because that's the way it's done by even the President of the United States.
Undoubtedly. You look at the situation with the Covington kids.
Yes.
Just a few months back, where people saw 10 seconds of video, and no matter what your political bent was, you had an immediate decision, and you were irate about it one way or the other.
Yeah.
We're in that time with video, with social media. You better be prepared.
One of the other things you talk about in terms of fireproofing your career is how to avoid a very toxic environment in the first place. What would you suggest there?
Sure. A few things are just basic research. Right now, you can go on Glassdoor.com and check that out. Mid to larger companies, you're going to be seeing reviews on there. And sure, you don't want to get too upset if you see one or two negative reviews, but if you see a lot of them and they're saying the exact same thing about it being a nightmare, you're probably going to want to either potentially believe them, or two, not take the chance.
Yeah.
You need to ask some good questions. I'll tell you a great example. I was in an interview a few years ago, and I asked what I thought was a softball of a question to the interviewer. So, what do you like most about this job? The person began shuffling back and forth in their seat, and they're looking at me. They're looking at their papers. They leaned across towards me a little bit and said, "Okay, nobody's in here. You do not want this job."
Well, that's the end of that.
Absolutely. Well, and I hit them a bit off guard with that question, which should have been an easy answer for them to give, the PR type of spin. But if they don't have a good answer immediately on what they like about their job, and they're trying to bring you in, take the hint.
Yeah, take the hint. I just love that line. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll get into a couple others real quickly. One of those is, of course, smoke detectors and whistleblowers. And most ministries and organizations have a whistleblower policy, so we'll talk about that. And then even fireproofing a volunteer, because a lot of us work in the area of ministry, whether it's churches or Christian organizations where we use volunteers. So those are just a couple of other very important principles. And before we're done, we'll go back to the website, which you might want to go to right now by going to our website, pointofview.net, and see some of the material that is available for you, because I think you're going to really enjoy this conversation. And if you would like to schedule Pete to come and speak to your group, your ministry, I think you would really benefit from it. And again, the book is entitled The Arsonist in the Office. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Pete Havel with us for a few more minutes. The book is entitled The Arsonist in the Office. Let me just mention, again, as a program note, Jerry Tuma will be with us. We'll be talking about some of the economic issues. I think you'll really appreciate that conversation as well. And one of those I accidentally skipped over that I was going to talk about is Alice in Wonderland and the Fiery Firing. And that is, we talked about hiring, but the one that probably is even more fraught, having had to fire a few people in my life as well, there are some real consequences. And talk about some of the principles that we want to actually apply and some of the procedures you want to follow if indeed you're going to let somebody go.
No doubt. One of the things that's important for any organization these days is to have values, to have principles, and stick to them. Because when you don't, you're causing yourself to have legal problems.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to be hurting your culture. You're going to be doing all sorts of things. Because if your employees can't trust you, you're not going to be much of a company, and you're not going to have a whole lot of success. So sticking by your rules is important. Order matters.
Yeah.
So that's a big thing, and especially when it comes to culture, dealing with the bad behavior in the workplace, you've got to know when to cut the cord. You need to have standards, because if you don't, if people realize that bad behavior is going to be potentially even encouraged if you keep somebody
sometimes
around,
rewarded.
you're going to be creating more problems. And like I said, when your employees no longer trust you or potentially fear your actions, you're in for a world of hurt.
I think so. So again, some great principles there. One of the other ones that I mentioned just a minute ago was the idea of being a whistleblower, because some of our listeners are in situations right now where they wonder, have we allowed too much illegal or unethical behavior? As you said, sometimes if the leadership is engaged in that, when you try to point to the problems, they just simply say, well, I'll point you to the door. But what about this idea of whistleblowers? Because I was appreciating the fact that you put that in that particular article as well. It's a whole chapter that you address in the Arsonist in the Office.
Absolutely. In terms of whistleblowers, and those tend to be the people that go outside the organization to maybe go to the authorities about a problem. Some of those things are fairly cut and dried, in that people could no longer take whatever the situation was. There was perhaps some illegality that was occurring, and if the organization wasn't going to address it, then they wanted to see somebody else do it. And that's certainly a problem of a culture when problems aren't being addressed. The other group that I talk about is what I call the smoke detectors. People that keep it inside, that are frankly just trying to be good employees. They see a problem, they want to fix it. That ought to be celebrated, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not so much in some organizations. And I talk about a few different case studies that I bring up of a guy that was working as a procurement officer. So he'd buy the equipment for his agency, and he gets a call from the vendor, the person that's selling it to them, and finds out that one of the procurement officer's coworkers has been on the take, has been receiving gifts, which is a big no-no. And he goes up the food chain, talks to his boss, says, hey, we've got a situation here. This obviously needs to be addressed. CEO nods, agrees that it needs to be addressed. And he finds out about 2 weeks later how it was going to be addressed. He was walked out the door and fired and had no idea what hit him. And that is something that people need to realize. Again, before you act in an organization, even if you are absolutely in the right, you need to be very careful about what you're dealing with, because the stand you're taking could potentially cost your career. I'm not discouraging people from not standing up for their values, for what they believe in, and for doing the right thing, but there is there can be a cost. And as we know from Scripture and anything else, standing up for what you believe in doesn't always end with a fully happy ending.
That's right.
It can cause some problems.
A lot of wisdom in this book. And just before we go, one of the other bonus chapters, if 21 chapters weren't enough, you have a bonus chapter on volunteers. And those of us in ministry have really depended upon volunteers over the years. I mean, where would churches be if we didn't have volunteers? Where would Christian organizations be without volunteers? But we also, of course, have volunteers in various membership organizations, Chamber of Commerce, things like that. So what kind of advice would you give for those of us that have to deal with volunteers as well, who might accidentally bring a volunteer arsonist into the group?
Exactly, and that's kind of what it addresses, dealing with those flies in the ointment that can cause problems. And a lot of organizations, and I talk about in a paying job, you can make the decision one way or the other whether you want to stay or go. You can go get a new job. In the military, if you better wait 2 years, or else they're going to get you for desertion. But there's a process in place, and your understanding of that you need to stick around for X amount of time. In volunteer organizations, if you've got a problem volunteer, there is nothing that is stopping the other volunteers, the good volunteers, from getting in their car and leaving.
Welcome. And it only takes one bad incident sometimes.
Absolutely, because they may have passion about the organization, but they're helping out. They can do other things with their time. And they can find other churches, other causes that matter to them. Nobody wants to be abused, and so they can walk away. And for me, that is the acute problem of what happens when you get a toxic volunteer into your organization. Number one, as my pastor's wife growing up in 5th grade said to me when I had a terrible singing voice, Jesus has other plans for me. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of truth to that with churches as well, that find this person maybe something where they may not have as much face time with other people. And you can make those types of judgments. And if it turns out badly, you can end things in a good way, but you don't want to have them wrecking everything that you've done.
Well, if nothing else, I wanted to let you know about this book, The Arsonist in the Office, because, again, it helps you fireproof your own life, deal with toxic coworkers, bosses, employees, cultures, and whether you have a business, whether you have a church, Christian organization, whatever it might be, I think you would benefit tremendously from the book. Pete, just before we go, we have your website, and on your website, there's a place where people can get a copy of your book. There's a place in which they could possibly schedule an interview if they wanted to do a radio interview with you or television interview for media. But also, if they just have you come and speak, I just think that you might have a whole career just going and speaking all over the country to some of these individuals that say, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. This is what we've been dealing with for some time. Now, give me some good, wise advice about what to do in this circumstance.
That's right. And really one of the things I talk about as much as anything else is encouraging people to do the things that they know to do already. Mm-hmm. And that nobody wants their employees to be targeted. Nobody wants a bad culture. But people issues are tough issues.
Yes.
We deal with them every day in some ways, but we also bury them because it's messy.
Yeah.
And my message for everybody, having been through a horrible workplace and writing a book on it, so obviously I have some passion there, is leaders make the tough decisions in dealing with your culture, because if you don't, there's a world of problems that's going to come, and you're going to better a whole lot of lives if you take care of those problems.
Like the old line, ministry is fun. The only problem is you have to deal with people. And that's what ministry is all about. That's what business is all about. That's what all sorts of different venues are. And again, the book, one more time, The Arsonist in the Office, I think you would really benefit from it. And Pete, thanks for coming in today here on Point of View. Just before we take a break, let me just mention that if you said, I have never heard anybody talk about this before on a Christian program, I'd like to find out more. We have a link to the website, but if you also appreciate the fact that we've taken the time to cover another one of those very important issues you don't hear about too often, hope you might visit the website, click on that button that says Join the Team Now. And as we come into our Easter weekend here, we still are looking for some of you to join with us financially, and for as little as $1 a day, $30 a month, $360 a year, you can be part of our Truth Team. But even a one-time gift would be a way of saying, hey, I really appreciated the interview. I'll give you a gift just to keep the program going. So it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. When we come back, Jerry Tuma will be in studio. We'll talk about your finances, all that coming up right after this.
It's amazing but true. When it comes to one of America's biggest household expenditures, healthcare, a lot of people think they've got no choice. People are used to thinking we have to do it this way, but they don't. Yes, you have the freedom to choose an alternative with your health care. It's MediShare, and it costs way less than the alternatives. The typical family saves $500 a month, not a year, a month. And if you're single, this can save you a lot too. And let's face it, a big reason MediShare is 400,000 people strong, it just works. They've shared over $3 billion in medical bills, so they can help share your needs too. Joining MediShare for so many people is one of those things that makes you say, why didn't I do this before? So yes, the time has come for something better. Look into joining MediShare and see why so many people are opting out of the old way and into the new. Why not look into this? Just call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. This hour we're going to spend some time talking with our good friend Jerry Tuma, who, by the way, is the founder and president of Cornerstone Financial Services. And as we've mentioned on this program many times today as well, and other times as well, we certainly encourage you to get some of this information that is available through him. And yet at the same time, this material we're talking about is more for general information, not for specific investment or tax advice. And I might just mention, if nothing else, that we're going to cover a number of different issues. If you're watching online, you'll see that I'm holding up right now some of the slides that Jerry has available on China. And we'll see in just a minute why we think China is very important and something to think about when you're talking about your investments. But also, since the last time we had Jerry on, we talked about debt, and the May issue coming out right now of the Outlook magazine is on debt. There is one chapter that actually deals with a whole issue of government debt, and then another chapter or section, I guess is probably a better way to say it, on personal debt. So whether we talk about the federal debt indebtedness or personal indebtedness, that is another topic we're going to be addressing. And I, by the way, even posted an article, not by Jerry, but by someone else, on the U.S. debt and how it got so big. And Jerry, we know how that happened. But let's, if we can, start off with China, because this is something you said you wanted to talk about. We do talk about how China is influential in terms of foreign policy. But unless you understand what's happening in China, you really won't understand what's happening in the economy. And that's really going to affect even people's thoughts about how they're going to make investments, isn't it?
Yes, investments. And really, you don't understand the economy without understanding China and how the role they play. Now, if you look at our history, of course, we've been the dominant economy for the last 150 years or so in the United States, and still are. And I'm not saying that's going to go away anytime soon. As a matter of fact, some friends of mine, the Bolio brothers, some of the best economists in the country in terms of their track records, like 98% over the last 5 years on the cycles. They said America will still be the dominant economy for generations to come, which would make some sense. China's going to have big problems demographically in about 10 years because of the one-child policy. I think there's like 1.3 males for every female over there under the age of like 35 or something like that. That's how you're going to handle that. But China is the major source of growth in the world. So if you look at the growth of the world, not just the United States, because we're kind of like this big fortress, we're more self-contained. Only about 12% of our economy is exports. So it's not a huge factor, which is one reason we're probably going to beat China in this trade war deal, because they're a lot more dependent on us than we are on them.
Very true.
And so we got the lever there on the negotiation processes. But if you look at the world economy, the United States is about 21% of the world economy, 21% of world GDP. Funny thing is, 55% of stock market capitalization. So 20% of the economy is producing over 50% of the stock market value in the world. That tells you that America might be doing something right, which I would, by the way, say, liberals, wake up, because that's not Europe that's dominating in the future, even though you want to copy socialism everywhere you go, et cetera, et cetera. But the bottom line is China's the growth story of the world. So the U.S. is kind of the anchor of the world economy. We're the dominant economy, the dominant stock market, and dominant financial markets. But China's going through a growth revolution that no one's ever seen in the history of mankind, literally. You've got 1.3 billion people that are deciding, that are now in their version of middle income.
Yes.
One of the first things they want to do is drive a car. So you can imagine, I don't know, all of us have been through puberty at some point. I still remember my son had the most spectacular growth spurt of anybody I've ever seen. I think he went from 5'2" to 5'10" in 6 months. It just straight up like that. If you envision that kind of growth, puberty-type growth, that's sort of where China is. They're still in the hockey stick approach. So you got this long, flat blade of the hockey stick, then you got this straight-up version of it. And China is about 60% of the way up there. In other words, they've been taking 15 million plus or minus people every year from the farms to the cities to build their factories, building infrastructure like the world's never seen. Literally, no one's ever seen the amount of airports and roadways and all that. It's funny, I got a copy, I think it's in that slide pack that I've given you. Several years ago, this is around 2005 or 6, I took a picture because for a while I subscribed to a magazine called China Today. And there's a picture of a superhighway on there with 1 million people city right behind it. And you look at the roads, and I asked the people in the audience, now, what's wrong with this picture? And they look at me and they go, well, there's no cars on it. And it's broad daylight. I said, oh, yes, there is. See, there's a semi-truck right down here, and there's like 3 cars on the whole monster highway.
But they could see it coming.
But then I show a new one of what traffic's like in China today, and it's just packed out. They had an actual 11-day traffic jam. Traffic jam for 11 days. People knew, well, let's see, I guess if I'm in a traffic jam, maybe I should turn my car off. Maybe we should buy tow trucks instead of only buying cars. This is all brand new to them. They don't know how to do any of this. So it's like they're going through the Industrial Revolution and the technology revolution all at one time. And again, because of their spectacular growth over the last 15 years, they account for about 33% of the world's economic growth. So the United States is 10% of world economic growth. China's 33% of world economic growth. And the other emerging markets, the younger brethren of China, if you will, that are behind them in terms of their development, like India, Turkey, South Africa, and so forth, they account for about 45% of world economic growth.
Wow.
So if you add China and all the other emerging markets together, which we used to call the underdeveloped countries, are now developing, trying to become third world. They're copying the good things of America, preferably. That's almost 80% of world economic growth. And it's long tenured. It's not going to be over overnight because this is a long track they've got. China's starting something called the One Belt, One Road Initiative, which I'm sure you've heard of. They want to take their expertise because, again, there was a point last decade where 70% of the construction cranes in the entire world were in China. They're unbelievable in terms of build-outs of roads, factories, airports, and all that. They're going to take their expertise, and they overdeveloped on steel and cement and all that, had surpluses, and they're going to try to connect all the way through Marco Polo's old Silk Road all the way back. As a matter of fact, Italy is the first nation in Europe to embrace this. And they said, hey, we're going to have a pact with you to renegotiate or redo this Marco Polo thing. But they're going to build airports, factories, ports throughout Southeast Asia. I've heard reports as much as, we're talking about maybe spending $1 trillion on infrastructure in the United States. I've heard reports as much as $8 trillion. Of course, it's probably a 30-year project, too. But what people don't understand is in investments in economics, Kirby, we have something we call a home bias. It's kind of like, okay, we tend to see things through the lenses of our immediate surroundings. That's why people in New York City can believe the world's overpopulated. I always tell them, hey, drive from Amarillo to Los Angeles and tell me the world's overpopulated. You have a different viewpoint. But anyhow, that's the side point. But the bottom line is people don't understand just how monstrous this build-out of infrastructure is going to be and how it's going to revolutionize the whole world. And by the way, I know China's still having persecution in their church, but when we come back from the break, that might be an interesting side note as to what has been happening over there as the freedom revolution, which is not political at this point, but it's happening economic and what that might mean for the long term. But China is the big dog when it comes to economic growth for the future.
When we come back, we'll talk about persecution in China, as well as you have some great charts here about the fact that if you want to talk about the people that are the biggest savers, it's the Chinese. And also the issue of debt, which is something we're going to talk about in terms of America's debt and our personal debt as well. So we have a lot to cover. Jerry Tuma with us. And again, he is with Cornerstone Financial Services. And if you would like to know some more about his organization, we have a link on our website. Matter of fact, if you'd like to get some of the charts I've been holding up here during the program, I'm sure he could make them available to you as well. It's all available at cornerstonereport.com. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
This month is when feminists in America have declared an unofficial holiday known as Equal Pay Day. They argue that women earn less than men. Therefore, in order to catch up with a man's pay from 2018, a woman must work until April. Now, the editors of the Wall Street Journal remind us that the comparison between men's wages and women's wages isn't really accurate when you consider other factors. Women, on average, go into lower-paying fields such as education. Mothers are likelier than men to actually choose flexibility over career advancement. I've cited similar data in previous commentaries that also illustrates the problem of comparing the aggregate data without taking into account other important factors. The editors point to a study by economist Mark Perry of the American Enterprise Institute, who has also suggested that we might want to implement an equal death day. The point that he is making is that men tend to take jobs with a much higher fatality rate. Look at the top 5 most dangerous jobs. Fishery workers have the highest fatality rate. Most are men. Next are lumberjacks, which are 98% male. After that are aircraft pilots, which is a profession that is 94% male. Roofers are 99% male, and garbage collectors are 88% male. Mark Perry's point is simple. When you look at the data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, you discover that men are much more likely to be killed while working. It's also worth mentioning that sometimes the increased risk does not show up in men's paychecks. Logging workers, for example, average $42,000 a year, which isn't much higher than what preschool and kindergarten teachers make. This is just another illustration about the choices men and women make about their jobs based on lots of factors. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From 20th Century Fox and Franklin Entertainment, Breakthrough, starring Chrissy Metz, based on a true story. Breakthrough, rated PG, now playing.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Jerry Tuma with us, again, founder and president of Cornerstone Financial Services. If you'd like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. Might just mention in my book, Christians and Economics, I spend some time talking about savings and debt. And Jerry, as you well know, Americans are not savers, but they're really good at getting into debt. And that's, of course, what is in our May issue, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But when I look at China, I see just the opposite of all the various, if you will, emerging economies. They're off the charts in terms of saving. Now, that's partially because they don't have Social Security and things like that. I think people in America get lulled into thinking, oh, I don't need to save for my retirement. I don't even need to save because, after all, the government will take care of me. But when I look at this, China is off the charts in terms of the percentile, the number of individuals who actually save, and it's one of the most significant savings rates I think I've ever seen.
It is, and it builds a huge pool of savings. Now, the interesting thing for them is they can put it in the bank account, stock market, or real estate, which tends to overpump the real estate sometimes. They don't have the kind of financial choices we do over here.
True.
But it's huge, again. So, it's just another area. I'm not saying China is going to replace the United States as the dominant empire unless something really bad happens to the United States, like a nuclear war, something like that. I still think that we're the best economy in the world and will continue to be so if we can keep the liberals from ruining everything. But the bottom line is China is number 2, and they're going to be number 2 for quite a while. And again, the interesting thing is we were talking about the church right before we went on the break. The underground church, again, is being persecuted once again. It's kind of like, a lot of our story, my wife and I, when you go through tough times, sometimes that makes you a better person. Sometimes it makes you a stronger Christian. Interesting, though, Mao came along in, I think it was 1949, if I remember right, and started the revolution, and they did away with private property, all religions, you name it, the Cultural Revolution. Around 1978, Deng Xiaoping came along because Mao died. He took over as the number 2 guy, and he said, one of his quotes was, I can either export poverty or I can export prosperity. We've had poverty for a long time. Why don't we try the other route? His father had been a wealthy landowner, so he had a background of that. Interestingly enough, not long after that, they actually brought Milton Friedman, who I believe is the most important economist the last 100 years over there, to teach them how to put free market enterprise principles in a communist government. And that sort of started their revolution. Interestingly enough, spiritually, Brother Andrew, you probably remember him, the author of God's Smuggler, had a thing called Operation Pearl not too many years after that. I want to say, 1990, let's see, that was 70, probably 85, late 80s, where they brought 1 million Bibles over there by sea and were able to distribute over 900,000 of them before the communists finally caught on and started destroying stuff. But the spiritual revolution has been impacting over there. So I believe that over time, if you give them economic freedom and continue to open up that, it's kind of like Pandora's box. I don't see you getting closed again. It, I believe, will eventually lead to freedom politically and human rights, which they don't have a lot of over there right now.
Very true.
But freedom is always a good sign, and freedom revolution, I think, is going to help China and eventually the rest of the world a lot.
Okay, let's talk trade policy. One of the charts here points out the fact that we, as Americans, are pretty much convinced that China is unfair. And if you didn't believe that, that's, of course, what the president's been saying for some time. So
and
what about
funny,
this whole
the
idea
Democrats
of trade
are
policy?
not fighting them on that either.
That's
steal.
one place where we got unanimity, I think.
We do.
About. Yeah.
The only place I can think of right now. But anyway, yeah, people pretty well know they pirate stuff.
Yes.
They force you to give them technology. Our Western firms go over there, United States firms go over there, and they force technology transfer, or you don't get to do business here. Hacking from China is routine, as far as we know. I mean, there's a piracy element to their markets now.
Yes.
There again, there's a lot of free market elements that they're trying to learn. But I always say, don't take off the training wheels yet. They are still trying to learn how to do free enterprise. They still have a lot of remnants of the old regime and the old ways of doing it, and corruption and all that. And Xi Jinping has been trying to crack down on corruption. They've had a lot of scandals in what we call their shadow banks, where they loan money out, non-bank banks. They still have state-owned enterprises that dominate a lot of areas. But they're also, they've got new technology. They've got a lot of free enterprise type, kind of like our billionaires over here with Zuckerberg and all those guys. They've got their version of those too. So it's a mixed bag of old world communism that's still around, hasn't gone away yet. What was that saying I heard, that progress happens funeral by funeral as people, the old guard passes away and the new guard comes along. So, but anyway, it's just an interesting study. When you take, again, as I mentioned, 15 million people a year and you move them from the farms to the cities to become factory workers, that's a monster displacement of human beings. Never been approached in world history, anything remotely like that. And, they're now buying more cars than we do in America here. They're now the highest source of demand for raw materials anywhere. China's just becoming a huge growth factor again for the world. And the reason I think this is important, I think, number one, it's important spiritually, because we do need to obviously pray for our brothers over there in China. There's a lot of them. At the same time, I think if you understand that this is not just about, kind of like we've had the old guard. The old guard, really, the true old guard was the Europeans. And they came along, and they were the first ones to attack Christianity with secular humanism type thinking and higher criticism and all those things, French rationalism that you and I know about from philosophy, which heavily infiltrated the Ivy League in particular and has started to take over a lot of the culture in America. But the power, if you will, is shifting away from them. Europe is really, and I hate to say it this way, but kind of a slow death spiral.
Yes, for a lot of reasons.
Demographically, they're getting older and older.
Yeah.
They're not having enough kids. They're not replacing the people. Their systems are messed up. Their banking systems are messed up. The socialism is still ripe. In France, I think 57% of France's economy is socialistic. It's government. So what's happening, though, is these countries, the new kids on the block, if you will, China and India. India tried socialism for 50 years, and it failed. And finally, Prime Minister Singh in 1991 said, okay, we've tried this long enough. And I don't know if you remember the movie with Patrick Swayze, whatever that name of that movie, where you see the complete deprivation, horrible poverty over there that they had as a result of that, and probably being afraid to eat cows because it might be your Aunt Margaret or something like that, false religions. But the bottom line is India is trying to copy what China's doing because they're seeing it works, and it's going to spread through that whole region. So if we look at it on the world basis, from God's perspective, if that's possible, it brings prosperity to those people. It's going to change the world that we live in, and I think also, by the way, it's going to be highly inflationary in the next decade as they continue to tap on resources, oil and gas, and things of that nature.
Well, one of the other things you have as one of your charts here is India versus China in terms of its population. Now, China's actually able to kind of keep it down for all sorts of very awful reasons, one of which is the one-child policy and those kinds of things. But India doesn't look like it's going to be ending anytime soon because one of your other charts shows just the demographic profile. And so you still have an exploding population in India, don't you?
And they're very young. It's something they've got, if I remember correctly, like 450 million people under the age of 25. So it's, again, 1.3 billion. They'll be larger than China by 2030. But it's a very young group. And, of course, young people, that's where the revolutions start. That's why they want innovation. They want to throw out the old standards that are not working very well. They're connected on the Internet. Of course, they have their own version of Hollywood. I guess they call it Bollywood. Which I guess produces more films than we do.
But they also want to come here on H-1B visas. They want to be.
They do.
And really, you got to recognize that there are more, if you will, high octane, highly built young people in India than we have individuals in this country. If you want to talk about national merit scholars, they got more national merit scholars than we have students because they have
right.
Trillion.
So many people.
Yeah, billion people, I should say, billion plus people. So this is the problem: is that very quickly they will dominate just if they have access to things like the internet, and because of the flat world that we've been hearing about. It does seem that India is going to be another one of those major players in the 21st century.
Very much so. I think, 30 years from now, if it takes that long, the dominant world powers will be the United States, China, and India, and not necessarily in that order. We'll have to see. But the Indians have a lot of sclerotic stuff. Corruption is really bad over there, probably worse than China in a lot of ways. But at the same time, again, they've got so many young people that want the goodies. They want what free enterprise brings. They can see it on their internet. They can watch what we do over here, and they want that kind of stuff. It's going to bring massive change to the world. And, of course, again, in the long run, if our goal is to evangelize, it opens doors. Matter of fact, I met with a guy who was a Dallas Seminary guy once who was over there, and he was talking about, and I'll make this quick because I know we're up to the break. He said, funny thing is, they used to go out and evangelize the outer regions, the rural areas, and it was so hard. They very rarely win a convert. Every once in a while they would, and then they'd come back 2 years later through the same village and find out that person had moved to the city. He said what's happened is God has birthed in every human heart the desire to improve themselves once they're free of the old baggage and they become a Christian. And so they would always move to where there was opportunity economically for their families.
Well, interesting. Well, again, if people wanted to get some of these slides, we've talked about these before, they can contact you because if nothing else, it gives you a little bit of an idea of how dominant China and eventually India, as well as some of these other growth countries will be. We'll be right back.
Question: do you have a health insurance plan you are not happy with? Well, Bethany and Jason thought they were stuck. Their plan just kept getting more expensive, and Bethany's favorite doctor didn't even take that plan anymore. And then some friends at church told them about MediShare.
With our previous insurance, we were paying $1,200 a month. With MediShare, we now pay around $600 a month.
Yes, they're paying $600 less per month, and that's a pretty typical savings with MediShare. And they actually like MediShare more.
I was able to go back to my original doctor that I absolutely loved, and it's just been an absolutely beautiful thing being a part of MediShare.
Yeah, so they pay a lot less and they like it more. No wonder MediShare is growing so fast. Find out more. They're super easy to talk to. All you have to do is call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Jerry Tuma in studio with us, and he is with, of course, Cornerstone Financial Services. And I thought for just a minute we would talk about debt. There's a couple reasons for it. First of all, our May issue, which I'm holding up right now, will be arriving in your mailbox very soon, and it's on the subject of debt. We have a chapter or a section on government debt, a section on personal debt, even one about Savings America. But then also they pulled, interesting enough, one of these interesting commentaries I wrote years ago called Inflation and Chuck E. Cheese. And the reason we use that is to recognize that if this debt continues on, one of the things Jerry Tuma shared with us last time is this idea of stagflation. The only way in which we're going to be able to meet our needs is for the government to print more money. And that, of course, is inflation. And I use the example from Chuck E. Cheese. If you've ever been to Chuck E. Cheese, the kids, they play the games. And the example I use here is they get 1,700 points and they get all these little coupons and they feel really good. Then they go to the toy counter and they go, oh, wait a minute, 500 points just to purchase a blow pop, 1,000 points to earn a Chinese handcuff. And I point out the fact that what has happened is very similar to what happens when the government prints money. That things that used to be fairly inexpensive are now more expensive. I point out that if you just look at a car that maybe cost $10,000 in 1980, now it costs $31,000. And it brings us back to a famous quote that you've heard us mention before. John Maynard Keynes said, "There is no subtler and more sure member and means of overturning the existent basis of society than to debauch its currency. The process engages all the hidden forces of economic law that come down on the side of destruction and does so in a manner that not one man in a million is able to diagnose." In other words, the subtlety of inflation. And inflation is where the government keeps printing more money, but it hasn't produced any more goods and services. And so the dollars in your pocketbook, the dollars in your wallet are worth a lot less. And that's where we're headed unless we see the government turning things around. And I don't see the government doing that.
No, I talked about this some of our seminars, Kerby, is 3 irresistible forces. A, are you going to stop the graying of America? Are you going to stop the baby boomers, which is 76 million people, as well as I do about the baby boomers and the demographics? Are you going to stop them from getting older?
No.
Probably not. They're going to keep getting older. Can you stop compounding debt? Einstein, I think it was, said that compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world, so it compounds on top of. So we got the $22 trillion you mentioned that's in, on the cover of your Outlook magazine. That's compounding and interest. Yeah. By the way, Moody's, of course, is a big rating agency on Wall Street. They said that the current debt structure in 2018, the U.S. government was paying about 8% of its budget revenue, was going to pay interest on the debt. Now, keep in mind, as you mentioned in this, it's more like interest on debt on credit cards. It's not like we use that to build factories and dams like China did. We've been just spending the money on social programs and runaway entitlements. And so the compounding of that debt, Moody's calculated by 2027, there'll be 23% of the federal budget just for interest on the debt. Again, you're not making any principal payments there. You're just continuing to push this thing further into the future, and there's a big cloud out there somewhere that this thing blows up if it's not stopped. So, can you stop compounding debt? Of course not. You can't renege on the $22 trillion we already owe. You can't stop the baby boomers from getting older. And the third thing is you're going to be able to stop the runaway entitlement program. Well, right now, we're not adding new entitlements with Trump in office, and we're not likely to in the immediate future, but look at what they're doing on the left. Someday, I hate to say this, but Republicans are not likely to stay in office forever. And the left, at least from my perspective, is trying to out-radicalize each other. It's kind of like a bidding war in an auction. Well, I'll bid this one. Free health care and, free college. And free everything. Yeah, reparations for slavery. Everything you can give away from the government, and it's all free, free, free. And they have this modern monetary theory which says, all that's just fine, and all we need to do, it doesn't, you can be 100 trillion in debt, 200 trillion, 500 trillion in debt. We don't care. Just print more money to pay for it. Well, that's a recipe, as we talked about last time, for hyperinflation, just rapid runaway inflation that is decimating to society. So we cannot let it go that way. But at the same time, you got to plan on it heading to some degree in the next decade unless you can stop one of those three forces.
Let's tie this in for just a minute. One of the articles I posted is the fact that 2/3 of the debt is held by the public, and there was a time when we held most of it. The argument used to be, well, we don't worry about the debt because we owe it to ourselves. Well, first of all, that's not true. And we just talked about China a minute ago. China, Japan, England, some of the Saudi company, or Saudi Arabia, and some of the Arab countries all own our debt. So first of all, that's not true. But even more so, this argument that, we'll only worry about debt when we're not in power. because that's another one of those myths we find
Yeah.
out. You know, there were so many Republicans concerned about the debt when Barack Obama was president.
I know.
I haven't heard of one of them, and including Donald Trump, worry about that. But now I hear all the Democrats upset because Donald Trump is in power. The harsh reality is, if you look at some of these charts, and you're real good about putting these charts together, the national debt goes up whether you have a Republican president or a Democratic president, whether you have a Republican Congress or Democratic Congress. Now, I'll be fair. Democrats raised the debt faster.
Right.
You almost doubled the national debt under Barack Obama in 8 years. But as you said, some of these intractable forces are just some things that our listeners need to plan for. If indeed we aren't going to have anybody get serious about paying down the national debt, then there are going to be consequences in terms of your finances, aren't there?
Absolutely, because again, you've got right now, back to the demographic issue, you've got 76 million baby boomers born between 1946 and 64, largest generation in our country's history until the millennials came along, which is was also called the echo boomers, the boomers echo from their kids.
Right.
But the bottom line is that the 76 million, only about a third of the baby boomers are currently on Medicare. By 2027, 2028-ish, 100% of the 76 million boomers will be on Medicare. Social Security is already run in the red. They've used everything in the fictional Social Security Trust Fund anyway, which Congress borrowed the money out of there and replaced it with a bunch of IOUs. I kind of say it's kind of like in the old days, you know, the wives used to save in a cookie jar, and you get in there and you find out you're ready to go buy your dress or whatever, and you open the cookie jar and there's a little note and says, honey, I borrowed the money. Of course, didn't tell you the husband went on a drunken binge in the city and blew the money. So how are you going to replace that? That's what's happened with Congress. They've gone on a drunken spending binge and taken all the money out of Social Security and already spent it. So the government owes itself, don't you know? So one department of the government, the regular part that has to have the deficits and the taxes, the operating budget, owes the Social Security Trust Fund money, a bunch of money, a lot of it. So there's really nothing there. And when as Social Security goes deeper and deeper into the red, that means they either have to tax people to get more money to pay Social Security back, or they have to issue a higher amount of debt, you know, national debt's running up, or they can print it. That's your choices. Push comes to shove, printing is the least painful thing, and that's what the politicians generally always do in the long run.
And the sad reality is, you know, we all supposedly paid our taxes on Monday. I know some actually postponed theirs. I took care of mine, but most people do. And one of the things I pointed out on Monday was that of the average taxpayer, $2,000 of their taxes went just to pay interest on the debt. So that doesn't build any bridges, that doesn't fund border control, that doesn't pay the salaries of people in the military, it doesn't continue the functioning of the government. It's just $2,000 of the tax bill that you paid went simply to pay interest on the debt. And if the interest rates keep going up, we're going to have more and more of our taxes go just to pay the interest on the debt.
Absolutely. So it's like a person that, let's say husband and wife both work in a metropolitan area, make $100,000 a year, spend $150,000 a year, put the extra $50 on a credit card, and then just continue to do that for 25 or 30 years. That's essentially what the government's been doing. And you mentioned, you know, the good grief, Gertie, the Republicans passed a budget where essentially 1/3 of the entire budget is overspending. It's deficit in this cycle. So I mean, this is craziness. It's just gotten completely out of control. And it reminds me of a saying. I've seen various different iterations of his name. Andrew Tytler Frazier is what we put in our book From Boom to Bust and Beyond. He said, democracies are a temporary form of government. This is paraphrased, but he said, you know, they only last until the populace decides that they can vote themselves benefits from the Treasury, and then they're destroyed through loose fiscal policy, which is exactly what Keynes was saying in your quote you just read about.
That's right.
Debauching your currency.
Yeah, and that famous quote, he said they can pay themselves largesse from the Treasury is how he said it. But again, he recognizes he was looking at these various republics, including the Athenian Republic, and he looked at various civilizations that any time the people can control that rather than the kings, because sometimes the kings had at least a little bit of wisdom, not always, sometimes they had some disasters as well. They basically spent themselves into bankruptcy, which when we come back, I want to talk about, okay, what can we do? And one of those arguments is you need to get yourself out of debt. You know, again, Proverbs 22:7, the rich rule over the poor, but the borrower is a servant to the lender. probably a better translation, the borrower is a slave to the lender.
Right.
So even while the federal government is in debt, best thing you can do is get yourself out of debt. And then we'll also talk about some of the other investment strategies. In case you would like to know more, we also have a link to Cornerstone Report, and it's on our website, pointofview.net. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. And again, one of the reasons we do this is we want you to be aware of the fact, as we've talked about in this particular articles or a series of articles that appear in Outlook, that the debt issue is significant. And so we have a chapter on government debt. We have a chapter on personal debt. And the first thing I would say is that a person who is not in debt and has cash, especially if you have a recession or a stagflation, cash is king. And so it seems to me that anybody that right now finds themselves a little bit concerned about what the future might hold at a time right now when we have plenty. This is kind of, I think it's Joseph, 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. Someday in the future, you and I don't know when it is, you're going to have some kind of mild recession probably, maybe even a bigger one. You're going to have something like stagflation, where you have inflation and a weird economy, which, again, for those of us old enough, remember what that looks like. And the best thing you can do right now is get yourself out of debt, right?
Really is. And, essentially, if you think about it this way, just compounding, you think about the return on cash especially if it's credit card debt or personal debt. Now, house, you can make the case that's an investment. A
Yes.
car, you can make the case that's an investment because
At
you
least
get
it's
back and forth
appreciating
to
in most
work.
cases. A house
Yeah,
might be.
yeah. I mean, you can go overboard with a car, obviously. You could do with a used car instead of a brand new car and that kind of thing. But the bottom line is consumer debt is the most destructive. And again, especially if it's credit card debt, because I mean, typically, I know some of them have low interest rates nowadays, but it's pure, if you want to call it that, waste. Matter of fact, we've written a book on personal finance years ago that I need to get redone called Smart Money. We were doing that one. Essentially, they found, the studies are that if a person uses a credit card instead of paying cash or writing a check when they go to the store, they will spend about 1/3 more, 34% more using the credit card.
I found that.
Why? And the reason is because the way we're hardwired, people are hardwired to avoid loss. They don't like loss. Matter of fact, all the behavioral finance studies have said the average person hates loss 2.5 times more vigorously, if you will, on their emotions than they enjoy the same amount of gain. So if you have a $1,000 loss, 2.5 times more emotion than a $1,000 gain. Well, the reason that it works that way is because if you whip out that credit card, it doesn't feel like a loss.
It doesn't. Yeah.
You're postponing paying that thing, whereas if you have to pay it cash or you got a certain amount of money in your wallet, you're losing some of that as the way it feels, or you're writing a checkbook, there's a limited amount of money in there. It processes in the brain differently. And of course, the retailers know that, and they take obvious advantage of that with every credit card imagination that you can get, sent to you in the mail. So I think that that's the first step of financial solvency, is to do that. Secondly, it talks about in Proverbs, wealth hastily gotten will dwindle. So most people that win the lottery don't end up with a lot of money left over.
Yes.
But he who gathers it little by little will increase it. So there's something about diligence, about saving, about putting money away for the future long term, whether you're putting in your 401k or savings account. So get solvent by, first of all, surgerying, plastic surgery, if you will, on those credit cards, get those paid off, and then begin to save and invest for the long run. Because the most important thing, Kerby, when we do eventually hit that wall, that fiscal wall, nobody knows where it's at. It's a psychological moment. You mentioned, China they own more of our debt than anybody else. Japan owes a lot of our debt. So close to 50% of the government's $22 trillion is owed by foreigners. They bought U.S. government treasuries to help us finance that debt. If they ever lose confidence that we're going to pay them back, that's what
that's it.
Economists of the International Monetary Fund, Ken Rogoff, called the bang moment, which all of a sudden, bang, now you've got a vacuum of, at this point, it'd be $10 trillion that's not there. Where are you going to replace that with? And that's when the hyperinflation kicks in gear, because at that point, the only alternative is for the government or the Federal Reserve to print money like nothing we've ever seen in history, modern history. So the bottom line is, best thing to do is get solvent and get prosperous.
One of the things we do talk about in these articles, which again we're making available to those of you that are donors, and if you're not, you could certainly ask for it, is we talk about, of course, personal debt and credit card debt and consumer debt and auto debt. And of course, let me talk to the young people for just a minute. The average college student graduates with more than $30,000 in student loan debt, and I've heard numbers even much larger than that, but we'll use the number that's being bandied around there. The average young person says, well, I got to pay off my debt right now. I'll worry about investing later. But if they're just setting a little bit aside each day in their 20s and 30s, they will reach millionaire status much better than if they set aside tens of thousands of dollars in their 40s and 50s, right?
Absolutely, yeah. The longer you compound the earnings, and the longer just putting a little bit away every day when you're young, you've got time on your side. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's a huge number. I think we compared, Robert, we call him Robert the Rabbit versus the tortoise. And so what they did was one guy put $2,000 away in his IRA for 10 years and then just forgot to do it after that. So from age 25 to 35 and didn't add any more money. The next guy started at age 35 all the way to 65, $2,000 a year. Same interest rate. I think we were compounding it like market results, 12%. Guess who won? The guy that actually put the little bit up front won, even though the other guy contributed for 25 years and he only contributed for 10 years, just because of the power of compounding and the number of years involved.
We're just about out of time, but first of all, before we say goodbye to everybody and wish them a wonderful Easter weekend, we have a link to your website, and I would imagine that, first of all, some of the people might want to see some of the slides that we talked about with China, or maybe they just like to know a little bit more about financial investment. Maybe you can give them a 10,000-mile wheel alignment or just give them an assessment. And so we have a link to cornerstonereport.com. But if people want to contact you, how are some other ways they can contact you?
Well, we have an 800 number, 800-327-4285. Of course, and you've got the link to our website right there, cornerstonereport.com. And either one, we're primarily an investment advisory firm, so we work with people that do have investments. We don't help people do budgeting or getting out of debt and that kind of thing. But primarily, people are we want to be in the wealth creation mode in the next decade plus, because ultimately we're either going to win or lose this culture war. We might lose it in the short run. We might win it in the long run, is my guess. But at the same time, those that are going to have the money, it's kind of like the golden rule. Who has the gold rules, basically. He's the one that makes the rules. We need to be in a position to be, I don't want to say power in like a power-hungry kind of thing, but influencers for the kingdom, which is one thing we can do, especially if God's given you some prosperous times.
Well, again, I would encourage you to contact Jerry and find out a little bit more. Again, some great resources that we have on the website. You, of course, have the radio program Smart Money. So, again, I would encourage some of our radio listeners and radio stations even to think about listening to the program, maybe carrying it. But also you have the archives of that.
Archives are all on the web. Yes,
and you can kind of go to school on all of this with Jerry Tuma. So, Jerry, thank you for giving us some time. I know you're kind of busy. But just before we go, I want to just say that, we're coming to the Easter weekend. I'll give you a preview tomorrow because it is Good Friday. We're actually going to let some of the staff off, so we're going to play a repeat. So I won't be talking to you live until Monday. But I do want to encourage you to consider this weekend as we come to Resurrection Weekend. A lot of people call it Easter, but I'd rather focus on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And the reason that we gather together here is because of our belief that he indeed died for our sins, rose again, and gave us the promise of everlasting life through a free gift that we can receive even as you're listening to the program right now. And so I hope that you'll take the time to visit your church. And if you do not have a church, as I said a little bit earlier in the program on the first hour, if you don't have a church, find a Bible teaching church. You need to go to that church and listen to God's word. I know that certainly we try to provide a biblical perspective here on Point of View, but I really encourage you to get involved in a local congregation because, as it says in Hebrews, we're not to neglect the gathering together with the body of Christ. So certainly want to encourage you to find some of the material that we've talked about today here on Point of View, and it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. Also, don't forget, you can still join with us as part of the team, and we certainly do appreciate any gift that you can give. Your financial support is crucial for us keeping this program on the air. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. I want to wish you a great Easter weekend and look forward to seeing you back here live here on Monday, right here on Point of View.
This Easter, from 20th Century Fox and Franklin Entertainment comes Breakthrough, starring Chrissy Metz, based on a true story. When Joy Smith's son John falls through an icy Missouri lake, all hope seems lost. But a mother's belief in the power of prayer inspires her community to trust God to do the impossible.
Please, God, send your Holy Spirit to save my son.
Breakthrough, rated PG, parental guidance suggested. Now playing. Tickets and showtimes available at breakthroughmovie.com.
Ronald Reagan.
Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. The only way they can inherit the freedom we have known is if we fight for it, protect it, defend it, and then hand it to them with the well-taught lessons of how they in their lifetime must do the same.
What are you doing to pass on truth and freedom? As one step, have you joined Point of View Radio's Truth Team? If not, why not? Join today. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.